It wasn't a gunshot. It wasn't a scream. It was the sound of a page turning. A dry, whispery sound in a sterile, fluorescent-lit room at the New York office of the Drug Enforcement Administration. Special Agent Jack Toal leaned over a spread of documents, his eyes burning from hours of staring at numbers, flight manifests, and customs reports. The year was 1975. The case was a ghost, a river of pure, uncut heroin flooding Harlem, and no one could find the source. The Italian Mafia families were squabbling over dried-up Turkish supplies. The French connection was severed. Yet on the streets, the dope was stronger, purer, and more plentiful than ever. It made no sense. And then he saw it. Not a clue but a negative space. An absence where there should have been a presence. A single entry in a ledger of seized and destroyed aircraft. A C-123 provider cargo plane, tail number specific, captured from enemy forces in Southeast Asia. Its documented history should have ended there, in a military scrapyard, its parts cannibalized, its identity erased. But Jack Toal had just seen that same tail number, clear as day, in a carbon copy customs log from a sleepy civilian airfield in Fayetteville, North Carolina. A plane that didn't exist, flying a route that made no commercial sense, logged 2 years after its official destruction. His finger stopped on the page. He didn't move. He barely breathed. In that silent, paper-cluttered office, Jack Toal had just stumbled onto the secret that would crack the biggest, most brazen drug smuggling operation in American history. A secret woven into the fabric of the Vietnam War, protected by shadows, and financed with the blood of 1,000 overdoses. The secret of Frank Lucas, and the dead American soldiers whose coffins he used as Trojan horses for his product. To understand how a Harlem gangster pulled this off, you have to understand the chaos he exploited. The late 1960s and early 70s were a period of American fracture. The war in Vietnam was a gaping wound, bleeding men, money, and moral authority. The military-industrial complex operated with near-autonomous frenzy. And in the jungles of the Golden Triangle, where Burma, Laos, and Thailand met, opium production was exploding, bankrolling warlords and covert operations in a shadow war that ran parallel to the official conflict. Frank Lucas wasn't just another hood. By 1968, he was the quiet, calculating power in Harlem, the protege and successor to the legendary Bumpy Johnson. But Lucas was a king with a problem. The traditional pipeline for heroin, through the French connection via the Mafia, was unreliable, impure, and expensive. The product was stepped on so many times by so many middlemen that it was barely 10% pure by the time it hit the street. Lucas, a ruthless businessman before he was a gangster, saw an opportunity for a vertical monopoly. Cut out every single link in the chain. From the Sicilian processors to the New York distributors. Go straight to the source. His inspiration came from an unlikely font. The daily news reports of the United States military in Southeast Asia. He saw the scale. He saw the logistics. He saw the sheer, unstoppable flow of material. Lucas's mentor, Bumpy Johnson, had drilled one immortal lesson into him. The only thing that matters is the product. To get the best product, Lucas went to the ultimate source. With fake IDs provided by a deeply corrupt U.S. Army sergeant based in New Jersey, he disguised himself as a civilian contractor. He flew to Bangkok, then, guided by connections money could buy, ventured into the treacherous jungles of the Golden Triangle. He didn't just sit in a hotel room and buy from a middleman. He sat across from warlords and generals in remote camps. He didn't just buy heroin, he formed a corporation. He negotiated directly with the most powerful supplier, a man known as General Heng, for pure, uncut, number 4 heroin. Laboratory purity, straight from the refinery. He paid in cash, in weapons, and favors. He established a business relationship built on volume and terrifying reliability. But securing the supply was only half the battle. The other half was a logistics puzzle of epic proportions. How do you transport hundreds, then thousands, of kilos of fine white powder from the mountain labs of Burma to the tenement streets of New York, past every customs agent, Coast Guard cutter, DA sniffer dog, and federal watch list in the world? Frank Lucas found his answer not on the high seas but in the sky. Specifically, in the planes of the United States Air Force Military Airlift Command and the Central Intelligence Agency's proprietary airline, Air America. The Vietnam War was a churning hurricane of men, material, and misery. The logistics tail was the longest in history. Cargo planes, C-123 providers, C-130 Hercules, flew daily from bases in Thailand, the Philippines, and Taiwan to American bases across the Pacific and back to the United States. They carried everything from ammunition to mail, from medical supplies to the solemn, flag-draped coffins of fallen soldiers. The system ran on trust, on honor, and on a sheer, overwhelming volume that made individual inspection impossible. Lucas saw a system built for a noble cause, and he saw a hole you could fly a fleet of bombers through. He didn't just bribe a pilot. He bribed an entire mechanism. Through his underworld contacts and the compromised sergeant, he connected with a network of corrupt military personnel and civilian contractors working for Air America and sympathetic supply sergeants. The deal was simple, cynical, and brutally elegant. His heroin, vacuum-sealed and waterproofed, would be packaged, placed in diplomatic pouches or crates marked as machine parts or aid supplies, and loaded aboard these official aircraft as non-official cargo. The payments were hefty, laundered through a maze of front companies. But the most grotesque and most secure method was the one that would later define the conspiracy. Inside the coffins of American servicemen. The sheer, chilling audacity of it was its own security. What customs officer, what grieving military escort, what God-fearing cargo handler would dare desecrate the sanctified remains of a fallen hero? The coffin, draped in the flag, was the ultimate diplomatic pouch. The heroin, branded Blue Magic on the streets for its devastating sapphire-tinted purity, flowed across the Pacific not in the hulls of rusty freighters, but in the bellies of birds painted with U.S. insignia. It was a psychological masterstroke. He wasn't smuggling past American authority, he was smuggling under its protection, wearing its uniform. The profits were biblical, almost fictional. Lucas was buying kilos for $4,200 in Bangkok and selling them for over $300,000 in New York. At his peak he was clearing $1 million a day. He bought entire city blocks in Newark. He wore a $50,000 chinchilla coat to the fights. He drove a custom purple Rolls-Royce. He gave out turkeys on Thanksgiving, creating a potent mythos of the benevolent neighborhood godfather. And he did it all while the NYPD's Special Investigations Unit and the fledgling DA were tearing their hair out. They knew the supply had changed. The heroin on the street was 98% pure, causing waves of overdoses, a grim testament to its potency. They knew a new, independent kingpin had dethroned the Mafia. They called him the Superfly. But he was a ghost. A rumor, a whisper in Harlem with no paper trail, no bank accounts they could find, no visible pipeline. Because his pipeline was flying in under the protection of the American flag, landing on secure airstrips, and was guarded by the unspoken laws of patriotism and grief. This is where Jack Toal enters the story, a man seemingly crafted in a laboratory to be Frank Lucas's antithesis. Toal wasn't a street agent kicking down doors. He was a researcher, an analyst with the DEA's New York office, a former New Jersey cop with a stubborn, meticulous mind built for patterns and puzzles. While other agents chased dealers on 116th Street, Toal sat in rooms filled with the dusty smell of paper and the green glow of microfilm readers. He was tracking money, and to track money you had to track movement. To track movement you had to understand systems. The break came not from a snitch but from a separate, tragic case file. A C-123 cargo plane, used in covert operations, had crashed in a remote part of Southeast Asia. It was carrying what was euphemistically listed as agency personnel. The wreckage was recovered. The tail number was logged, documented, and the plane was officially listed as destroyed. It was a closed file, a piece of classified debris in the vast landscape of the war. But Toal, in his endless cross-referencing, had a separate pile: civilian airfield manifests from the southeastern United States. These were the bland records of general aviation. Small planes, private charters, the forgotten paperwork of regional airports. Pilots were required to file flight plans, and overworked clerks would log tail numbers. It was bureaucratic noise. Until it wasn't. And there it was, like a dead man's signature on a lease agreement. The tail number of the destroyed, supposedly scrapped CIA plane, logged at a small, obscure airfield in Mena, Arkansas. A place already whispered about in connection to other shady flights, and again months later in Fayetteville, North Carolina. A plane that by every official record was molten aluminum, was somehow making domestic cargo runs. A cold, sharp wire of comprehension touched Toal's spine. This was no clerical error. This was a secret hiding in plain sight. This was a ghost plane. An asset that had been written off the books but remained in service for purposes that didn't appear on any official manifest. And his analytical mind immediately posed the terrifying question. If one ghost plane exists, how many others are gliding through the skies, invisible to official scrutiny? He took his findings to his supervisor, his heart pounding with the thrill of the hunt. The reaction was not the eager leap into action he expected. It was a wall of caution. A deep, institutional, bone-deep caution. He was listened to, then told, in not so many words, to be very careful about the connections he was drawing. The implication was thicker than the file in his hands. Some lines of inquiry led into tunnels so dark and deep that even the DA wasn't sure it had the authority, or the political capital, to enter. The CIA and the military were sacrosanct territories, especially in the weary, cynical, post-Watergate, post-Vietnam era. To accuse them of being accessories to drug running was not just a case. It was a career-ending, potentially institution-shattering grenade. But Jack Toal was dogged. The ghost plane haunted him. He quietly, persistently began to connect the spectral aircraft to a name that kept bubbling up in low-level informant reports from Harlem: Frank Lucas. Not as a flashy kingpin but as a ghost himself, a source. He started building a map, not of street corners but of flight paths. He charted the ghost plane's hypothetical route, from Udon Thani in Thailand, to Guam for refueling, to Elmendorf in Alaska, then down into the continental U.S., to obscure airfields in Arkansas and North Carolina. He theorized the heroin was transferred to ground vehicles in the rural South, where law enforcement was sparse and federal presence minimal, then driven up the I-95 corridor in nondescript vans to New York. He was constructing the architecture of a conspiracy from a desk, without ever firing a shot or kicking down a door. And with every document, every matched number, the shadow of official complicity grew longer and darker. He wasn't just investigating a drug dealer. He was inadvertently tracing the outlines of a rogue circuit within his own government. The tension here wasn't in a dramatic raid or a car chase. It was in the quiet, daily horror of comprehension. The moment Jack Toal realized Frank Lucas wasn't just evading the law, he was leasing it. He had hijacked the logistics of the Cold War itself. This was bigger than narcotics. This was a fundamental breach of national trust, a corruption of the very instruments of American power projected abroad. Every flight manifest was a page in a ledger of betrayal. The ghost plane wasn't just a vehicle, it was a symbol of a system so vast, so compartmentalized, that it could be used against its own people without anyone in the brightly lit offices of Washington seeming to notice, or worse, caring to stop it. Toal's world narrowed to the paper trail. He lived with the smell of photocopier toner and the acrid tang of old mimeograph ink. He memorized tail numbers, flight codes, and the names of shell companies that existed only on a letterhead in a lawyer's office in Delaware. He knew he was circling something monumental, but proving it required piercing a veil of secrecy thicker than any Mafia omerta. The mob feared prison. The people he was now tangentially investigating feared exposure, congressional hearings, the unraveling of decades of covert policy. They were protected by a shield labeled national security, and Toal was just a DA agent with a stack of paper. Meanwhile, in his parallel universe, Frank Lucas operated with the impunity of a man who believed he had outsmarted the universe. His confidence was a physical presence. He began to see himself not as a criminal, but as a master strategist, a CEO who had successfully outsourced his logistics to the most powerful entity on Earth. He threw lavish parties, bought more property, and solidified his Robin Hood legend in Harlem. The two men, the agent and the kingpin, were living in divergent realities, one in the glaring, garish light of notoriety and adulation, the other in the subterranean, flickering glow of a microfilm reader. Their collision course was set by logic and evidence, but only one of them, Toal, peering at his documents, knew the impact was inevitable. Toal's meticulous, paper-based detective work eventually provided the fragile, yet actionable intelligence the street agents needed to shift from suspicion to surveillance. A dedicated task force was formed, operating on a need-to-know basis. The surveillance on Frank Lucas and his web began, and the sheer, audacious scale of his operation confirmed Toal's most disturbing hypotheses. They watched Lucas's lieutenants, men in sharp suits and driving luxury cars, meet with rugged, military-looking men in diners off interstate highways in the Carolinas. The conversations were brief, the exchanges sometimes a simple handoff of keys. They tracked money flows through a dizzying network of shell corporations that eventually led to banks in the Cayman Islands and Panama, before the trail vanished into the ether of offshore secrecy. The first major crack came not from the sky but from the ground. Agents arrested one of Lucas's key couriers, a man known as Les Irwin, a southern gentleman with connections to the racing world. Facing decades in prison, Les broke. His confession was a roadmap. He described the remote airstrips, lit by portable generators in the dead of night. He described the transfer of heavy, nondescript duffel bags from unmarked planes into unmarked vans. He described the sheer, terrifying volume, hundreds of kilos at a time. He spoke of the eerie silence of the operations, the lack of fear, the sense of official sanction. It wasn't like a drug deal, he reportedly said. It was like a military supply drop. The final, crushing piece fell into place from the most intimate source of betrayal, Frank Lucas's own wife, Julie. Fearing for her future and disillusioned with the life, she agreed to wear a wire. The recordings captured Lucas in his unguarded moments, boasting about his connect, disparaging the Mafia as amateurs, and detailing in oblique but damning terms the mechanics of his special military delivery. The evidence wall in the DA office was no longer just about Frank Lucas, the Harlem kingpin. It was a sprawling web that touched obscure airfields, shadowy hangar leases, and the names of men with legitimate military ranks and dubious off-duty incomes. The takedown, when it finally came, was a coordinated tsunami meant to overwhelm any chance of warning or retaliation. November 1975. Codenamed Operation Jilo for Julie Lucas. Over 200 agents mobilized across continents. Arrests unfolded simultaneously in New York, North Carolina, Alabama, and even Bangkok. They seized over $600,000 in cash, enough pure heroin to kill a city, and a mountain of documentation that traced the conspiracy from the poppy fields of the Golden Triangle to the project stairwells of Harlem. But the real, defining drama occurred not in the flash of raid jackets, but in the stale, tense air of an interrogation room in Manhattan. Frank Lucas, the billionaire gangster, was brought in. He was initially confident, almost bored. He believed his high-priced legal team and his web of corrupted officials would make it all go away. He faced the street-savvy narcotics agents with a condescending smirk, talking about his charitable contributions, his Thanksgiving turkeys, treating the whole proceeding as a vulgar misunderstanding beneath a man of his stature. Then the door opened and Jack Toal walked in. Toal didn't have the physical bearing of a narc. He wasn't trying to intimidate. He carried the calm, weary certainty of a man who had already seen the entire play, who had read the script. He didn't ask about street corners or kilos. He quietly placed a series of photographs on the scarred metal table. Not of drug deals but of airfields. Of specific C-123 cargo planes on distant tarmacs. He slid over photocopied pages of manifests. He recited tail numbers, the ghost numbers, without looking at his notes. He mentioned specific, obscure bases in Thailand, names like Udon Thani, and talked about flight corridors over the Pacific. He spoke the cold, precise language of logistics, the mechanics of the conspiracy, in a flat, uninflected tone. The change in Lucas was instantaneous and profound. The smirk melted away, replaced by a slow dawning shock. This wasn't the game. He was ready for questions about Harlem. This man was asking him about Guam. He was prepared to deflect inquiries about the Mafia. This agent was talking about the CIA's proprietary airline. The color drained from his face. The invincibility he felt, the genius of his plan, was being dismantled not with threats or violence, but with devastating, incontrovertible knowledge. They knew how it worked, they had the blueprints, and if they knew that, they knew everything. They knew the secret that was the foundation of his entire empire. According to agents present, Toal leaned across the table, his voice dropping to a near whisper, devoid of bluster but loaded with finality. "Frank," he said, "you're not in Harlem anymore. You're playing in the major leagues now. And we know who your teammates are." It was the psychological kill shot. Lucas had built his empire on a secret he believed was untouchable, the sanctity, secrecy, and unassailable authority of government operations. Now, this quiet, unassuming man in a rumpled suit was laying that secret bare on a cheap government-issue table. The cloak was not just torn, it was incinerated. The major leagues he thought he was playing in weren't protecting him. They were the very institution this agent had meticulously dissected. Lucas's bravado evaporated, replaced by the cold, survivalist calculation of a cornered animal. The empire was gone. Now it was about salvaging a life. Facing the certainty of multiple life sentences in a maximum security prison, and realizing with chilling clarity that the powerful friends he'd bribed were now fleeing for cover or were perfectly willing to let him be the sacrificial lamb, Frank Lucas did the unthinkable. He flipped, he agreed to cooperate fully. To secure a reduced sentence for himself and his wife, he would testify against the corrupt law enforcement officials he'd paid off, and more critically he would provide names, dates, and routes. He would point the finger, however carefully, at the corrupted sergeants, the greedy contractors, the mechanics of the sky who had fueled his ascent. In a twist of bitter irony, the man who built his empire by exploiting the machinery of American power would now seek his own salvation by exposing its rusted and compromised cogs. His testimony became a seismic event in the world of law enforcement and organized crime. It led directly to the conviction of over 100 corrupt officials, including the notorious NYC detective-turned-drug lord Nicky Barnes, a rival Lucas helped dismantle, and the New Jersey state trooper who had been his early fixer. The headlines were spectacular. But the bigger fish, the CIA connections, the high-level military personnel who had turned a blind eye or actively facilitated the scheme, largely slipped the net. Cases that ventured too close to Langley were mysteriously dropped by prosecutors citing national security concerns. Key witnesses suddenly developed profound amnesia or retired to remote locations. Documents were reclassified or simply disappeared. The full, ugly, sanctioned truth of the Coffin connection was quietly buried in classified files and hidden behind the impenetrable wall of state secrets. The ghost planes were grounded, but the shadows that had spawned them and the system that allowed them to fly remained largely untouched. Jack Toal had followed the thread of evidence with relentless integrity to the very heart of the labyrinth. He had found the chamber, seen the outline of the beast. But the Minotaur, it turned out, was protected by a decree. It was a state secret and thus untouchable. Frank Lucas, the man who smuggled $50 million of heroin in CIA planes, would serve less than 7 years of a 70-year sentence. Released into the fog of witness protection, he was paroled in 1981. He became a macabre folk legend, his story sanitized and glamorized by Hollywood, transforming him from a ruthless exploiter of war and grief into a cunning anti-hero. He lived a long life, dying in 2019, a walking, talking testament to both staggering criminal ingenuity and the American system's immense, often unacknowledged capacity for corruption. He traded the empire of blue magic for a quiet, anonymous existence, his name forever etched in history as the man who pulled off the impossible, and was caught by a man who believed the impossible could be documented. Jack Toal continued his career at the DEA, rising to a supervisory position. He was respected by his peers, a legend within the analytical branch. But he was forever marked by the Lucas case. He had achieved the impossible. He'd toppled a billion-dollar empire not with brute force, but with the weapon of forensic paperwork. Yet the victory tasted of ash. He had proven, conclusively, that a gangster could buy his way onto the most secure flights in the world, but he could not dismantle the silent machinery that had allowed it to happen. The institutional walls had closed ranks with a finality that was more profound than any mob silence. The ghost planes kept flying in the back of his mind, a permanent humming reminder of the limits of justice when it collides with the cold, hard imperatives of the secret state. He had won the battle against Lucas, but the war against the enabling darkness was one he could never truly wage. The moment in that quiet, fluorescent-lit office, with the single-turn page and the 2 matching tail numbers, was more than just a professional breakthrough. It was a profound loss of innocence. It was the moment a dedicated, by-the-book agent realized that his most formidable opponent was not the flamboyant crime lord in the chinchilla coat, but the silent, immovable fortress of official secrecy and institutional self-preservation that crime lord had learned to rent. It was the understanding that some crimes are so vast they blur into unofficial policy, and some conspiracies are so operationally convenient they are passively tolerated. Toal saw the seam where criminal enterprise stitched itself into the fabric of national security, and it was a seam the government would not allow him to unpick. The story of Frank Lucas is not merely a tale of a drug kingpin's arrogance and fall. At its core, it is the story of the agent who noticed. It is a chilling study of the fragile, often invisible line between national security and national scandal. It confirms the haunting truth that sometimes, the most dangerous contraband does not slip through the cracks in the system. Sometimes, it flies home, first class, in the system's own vehicles, wrapped in a flag and guarded by the very myths a nation tells itself about honor and sacrifice. It is a tale of 2 kinds of power operating in America. One flashy, brutal, and ultimately fragile, the power of the individual kingpin. The other is quiet, bureaucratic, institutional, and infinitely more resilient, the power of the state to absorb scandal, classify failure, and move on. Jack Toal challenged that second, more formidable power armed only with a stack of paper, a sharp mind, and a belief in the rule of law. In doing so, he exposed a darkness far more profound and enduring than the crimes of Frank Lucas alone. He exposed the vulnerability of a system that believed its own secrets made it inviolate, and in that exposure, however partial, he performed a deeper, more thankless service. He proved that even the most perfect secret leaves a paper trail. And sometimes all it takes is one man in a quiet room, to turn the page and decide to follow where it leads, no matter how high or how dark the path may go. If this story of shadows, secrets, and the courage to follow a hunch gripped you, hit that subscribe button. We dissect the cases that changed the rules, and the often unsung agents who risked everything, sometimes even their faith in the system, to follow the evidence. Drop a like if you believe Jack Toal's quiet, diligent integrity was as heroic as any street bust or gunfight. And in the comments below we want to know, what do you think is ultimately harder to defeat, a brilliant criminal mastermind or the institutional blindness and secrecy that allows him to thrive? Turn on notifications because next time, we're diving into the story of the undercover agent who infiltrated the heart of the Medellin cartel by becoming Pablo Escobar's favorite, most trusted American pilot. Remember, in a world of noise and violence, sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't a badge or a gun. It's a ledger that doesn't lie, and the stubborn will to believe what it tells you.